Hey everyone, and welcome to the Batovi channel. Just a heads up, here you can find several web dev tutorials as well as live stream coding sessions because at Batovi, we specialize in front-end development, Angular, React, Node.js, DevOps, project management, UX, and a lot more. Just a side note, if you or your team feel you need some free consultation, be sure to reach out to contact@batovi.com for a free consultation session. I'm Travis Draper. I'm a React developer at Batovi, and in the next half hour or so, we're going to dive into all things DevOps. Joining me today are Mick McGrath and Chris Capell, and aside from both of them having very illiterate names, they are DevOps experts at Batovi, and we're going to pick their brains. Chris and Mick, to start, let's introduce ourselves by answering the question, what do you think DevOps is? I'll demonstrate. As I said, my name is Travis Draper. I'm a React developer at Batovi. And I think DevOps is a mug of hot cocoa on a cold winter's night. Chris, what about you?
My name is Chris Capell. I'm a DevOps consultant here at Batovi. It's great to be here today. To me, when I talk about DevOps to me is a corporate culture, one that values, the speed to market, the agility that comes from automation and repeatable tasks. There's a lot of communication involved, and we want to make sure we have the continuous feedback. So when we are doing something right or we need to do something better, we know about it.
Cool. What about you, Mick?
I'm Mick McGrath, Director of DevOps at Batovi. I'm coming to DevOps mainly from the developer side of the house. I started my career as a developer. To me, DevOps is the collaboration of developers and operators and other individuals really to streamline the process of getting code from local machines out into production securely. And once they're out there, they stay up and running. But more than that, it's like I said, it's the culture of collaborating together to make that happen.
Nice. So I may have been just a hair disingenuous in that I probably know a bit more about DevOps than just a delicious mug of cocoa on a cold winter's night, but honestly, not much. It sounds like based on your responses, I have a good bit to learn. So that's the inspiration and the point for this talk. Like I said, I have a front end background, but when it comes to DevOps, which I know is an essential piece of the puzzle in the delivery flow, it's just such a black hole for me. I have no idea what goes into it, and I don't really know the finer details or everything that comes out of it. And so that's why I want to pick your brains, because hopefully I can learn something, and then anyone tuning into this conversation can learn something too. But two caveats before we dive right in. The first caveat, or the first asterisk rather, is a lot of the questions that I have for both of you come from this article, actually, that our own Mick McGrath wrote that's on the Batovi website called The Complete Guide to DevOps. It's a really great primer for a lot of the essentials of DevOps, and there's a few links in there to other sources. And reading through it, I came up with all these questions that I didn't even know I had questions about. So if you watch this Twitch stream and you come away curious, I encourage you to go check out The Complete Guide to DevOps. And the second asterisk is, I've talked with Chris and Mick before. These two have a lot of opinions and a lot of intelligence to share, and they can really bounce off of each other. So I politely reserve the right at any point during our Q&A, if we need to kind of keep the ball rolling a little bit, to casually lift up my little stop sign here to kind of put a little break on the conversation thread, maybe come back to it at the end if there's time. Or else promise a future conversation to dive in with more detail. Are y'all cool with the stop sign? Do we think that's rude, or is that okay?
That's fine.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I'll also add to that, if for some reason we are stopped, we do have Batovi does have open source office hours directly after this. If you join the Batovi community Slack, you should be getting a notification in either the general room or the DevOps room for how to join that, and we can continue the conversation there.
Yeah, good point. Thanks, Mick. All right, so let's kick it off. And the first question I have for you guys is a real basic question, but like anytime I try to like type a message to a DevOps person and like refer to the DevOps person by their title, I always have to spend some brain power to think about it. So how do y'all refer to yourselves? What's your noun? Like, I am a DevOps engineer, DevOps architect, DevOps close-up magician. Mick, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so this is I've definitely got opinions about this. One thing that I don't refer to myself as, and what I try to encourage other people to not refer to themselves as, is a DevOps engineer. There's really no such thing as a DevOps engineer, except when there is, which is something maybe I'll get into later. But typically, especially at Betovi, we refer to ourselves as DevOps consultants. So our goal is to consult with our clients to, encourage that the culture of collaboration and things like that. And obviously, we do a lot of implementation stuff too, and there are different ways to refer to people, whether it's like SRE or cloud engineer, things like that. So there are a lot of different ways to refer to people who work in this space, but I typically refer to myself as a DevOps consultant.
Okay. What about you, Chris?
Well, I like to consider myself a Jedi Master of DevOps. I had my own little plaque made up. But truthfully, I'm a DevOps consultant here. I do agree with a lot of what Mick said. I disagree. I think there is such a thing as a DevOps engineer. I think that the DevOps engineer is the creamy center of an Oreo cookie, kind of holding everything together. Where we talk to they're the ones that are talking to operations who are doing the day-to-day work. They're talking to security. They're talking to the operations team. They might be talking to an SRE team, platform engineering team. There's a lot of more that goes into supporting your app, especially as the organization gets larger than just one person. And what I said, we want to make sure we streamline things, remove barriers for, to get things in place. A lot of that should be letting the developers focus on developing. Let's go through and take that load off of how we get things deployed. You don't care about the security. You want to make sure it's secure, but at the end, you don't care if I have, a permission on somewhere because that's the way an auditor said it has to be. So,
okay. You mentioned you popped a word in there that I'm glad you did, because I wanted to branch off of that with a kind of a follow-up question there, sort of the etymology, if you will, of the word DevOps itself. It sounds like it's two things, right? DevOps, developer operations. You use the word operations. And Mick and Chris, this one is to either one of you that wants to answer first. What is the difference between developer side and operation side? And these are my two fists. Whichever one of you wants to respond first.
I'll field this one first. I'll let Mick follow up. So when we start talking about, developer and operations would be your day one, day two. Let's make sure your application is running. They're the ones making sure the little things that you don't care about, like backups, are being done. They're checking the uptime. They're getting the alerts, the pages if something goes wrong. Or developers kind of more focused on, let me get my code and, design this app and put this app into the repository to be deployed. So that's kind of where you get into the DevOps, is where you kind of get that mesh. And that's kind of where I get my Oreo filling, is where I'm kind of meshing those to get together, where I'm talking to the developer, say, okay, give me your code. We're going to build it, get it deployed, and we're going to put it in a way that the operations team to hand off to. So we're kind of in the middle, I feel. Obviously the size of the organization matters. A small organization might not have a dedicated operations team, or a large one might have, that DevOps department might be 10 people and each do a different thing. One might be doing code, cloud deployments. Another one might be focused on Kubernetes. So that's kind of where my thought is.
Mick, I'm gonna let you respond, but I want to pepper an additional question on top of this one that's connected, and then you can also feel free to bounce back to the what's the difference thing. Wow, I feel like a political moderator at like a debate right now. And you have 90 seconds on the clock now. No, speaking of the developer and operations and like what's the difference. One thing I remember I pulled from the complete guide to DevOps was this quote that basically, or like the paraphrase quotation that like development teams, the goal of a development team is to iterate and make changes quickly, whereas an operation team wants to ensure that the running system remains stable. And you know, a solid way to keep a system stable is through minimizing change. So one wants to iterate quick change, and then the other one wants to minimize change, destructive change. But then you put those two words into a single role, DevOps. One wants to minimize change, one wants to like maximize change. How do you, as a DevOps consultant, how do you resolve that paradox for yourself? Mick, why don't you take it away?
Well, you get people to talk to each other for one, so like, developers, their incentive to make change, most of their activity, most of the developer activity involves writing their code, pushing their code to a repository, running tests and builds, publishing their artifacts. What artifacts are published and how those get deployed, there's like a boundary between what developers do and how their applications exist out in the world. And one good place to look for, especially like in a cloud native world, is, or one lens to look at this is if a developer is focusing while building their application with an understanding of where it's going to exist. Like if you're doing microservice development, you might want to look at like the 12-factor app and have concepts like, don't bake your memory into your app. Like apps should be able to be spun up and torn down and all that kind of stuff. Like keep your data off of the instance. So they need to be developing the applications with the end infrastructure in mind, and have like some concepts of how it's going to actually exist out in the world. And then the operations folks would be incentivized to provide mechanisms of automation to allow developers and allow applications to get through the automated process while maintaining stability. So there are a lot of metrics around the operation side where you look at to make sure that the application, or to make sure like the infrastructure and the applications in the infrastructure are reliable. You have your observability layer to give you alerts and data about the applications and the infrastructure that's running so that they can maintain that stability and provide tools to developers so that if something goes wrong, they're able to get in and debug it and fix it regardless of what environment is, and streamline the process to get the changes back out.
So sort of what I'm hearing, it sounds like operations, when, at its best when working with development, provides the development team tools and methods to actually maximize their change output while minimizing any destructive or problematic changes that could occur, like pipelines and debugging investigation tools and logs and such. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's generally the goal.
Okay. Cool.
Chris, you're on mute.
Chris, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Chris, we can't hear you.
You got a good pantomime going on though with the face off.
So I'm sorry. My dog was barking, so I had to mute myself earlier. So coming from the operations side, I have a different perspective. I look at it as, I agree with a lot of what Mick says, but we tend to want to look at it as far as risk. How do we minimize the risk of something going wrong? And I think DevOps actually helps us by able to enable you to deploy more often. You can deploy smaller changes. That smaller changes has a much greater chance of not blowing everything up. So we want to make, small changes controlled, knowing what change. If you go through and have a month-to-month change where you're changing everything, you don't know what broke. You don't know what change actually broke it. So that's kind of where I look at DevOps, is actually helping operations control that risk by able to make smaller change. We're using automation, so we're not having, human error when we're making these changes. And it's just, everybody's just happy-dokey, hopefully.
Okay, so adding to the ability for operations to provide tools for ensuring like the minimizing the potential of developer error by capturing problems, or providing tools and log output to debug any existing errors, there's also the addition of encouraging and providing the ability to maximize releases, incremental releases, smaller incremental releases, to again minimize any major change fluctuations. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I would say that's a good
Oh,
statement.
cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. I like the statement too. All right. Thank you guys so much. So there's a couple. So when I, again, like as a React developer, I don't know anything about the DevOps field, and that's why I'm here today. And so there's like some definitions and some terminology sort of that I hear sometimes bandied about. I don't get to use that word a lot, bandied. That I would love to like bring up here and get like a kind of a clearer picture from the two of you about. And this is actually, I pulled this one as well as from the What is DevOps article. On the complete guide to DevOps, Mick, when you wrote that, you mentioned wanting in a DevOps connoisseur, my word, not yours, connoisseur, people that are familiar with, responsible for at least these three elements. Can you give a brief like digest as to what these elements are, like what they practically mean? Those are automation pipelines, infrastructure as code, and scalable architecture. Mick, why don't you start this one off?
Yeah. So automation pipelines are, they're the engines that run your tests, your build process, your deployment process. A lot of pipelines will have connections between your CI layer, which is build, test, and publish, and triggering your deployment side, which is deploying your infrastructure as code, which I'll get to in a second. But like automation pipelines, you've got like GitHub Action Runners, you've got GitLab pipelines, Bitbucket pipelines, like all of these. Jenkins is another one. So there are a lot of like basically it's a machine that lives not on your system, ideally connected to your source control, that you can configure to perform tasks whenever events happen, like checking in code or creating a version in Git or something like that. Infrastructure as code is generally like defining in a checked-in way in GitHub or in your source control what your infrastructure looks like. So there are a lot of tools for this, like Terraform, Helm, Ansible, Pulumi, a lot of different types of things that you can use to define your infrastructure. And the goal is you define what your infrastructure looks like in code and check that in, and then you run a deployment against that, and it makes your environment look like you've described it to be. So that you can have version change over time. You can do more audits and pull requests to make sure that changes that are coming in, as opposed to like going directly to a cloud provider, or like go to AWS and click around in the console and create a virtual machine or whatever. Ideally, you're not doing that. Ideally, you're defining everything in a way that it is version controlled. So that's infrastructure as code. And the other one was what? Scalable architecture?
Yes.
Scalable architecture is, it's sort of a broad way of looking at this, but like some of the ideas in a scalable architecture would be, like I said, ensure that all of your services are able to exist with more than one replica. There's some concepts in there for like how to pass data and things like that. For your infrastructure, if you get a whole lot of load that's going to overload your current infrastructure, can it grow automatically? Can it scale down if you have low traffic load? And then there's a bigger concept for high availability and disaster recovery. I think would probably also be in here. High availability is to make sure that if you're deploying your application in a cloud provider and you're in like the East region, and like the East region goes down in your data center for some reason, that you're still up and running. So you're highly available, meaning that you have a pretty good tolerance for outages in various locations and things like that. That's not the full picture. But then also disaster recovery is, there's a bit of overlap between high availability and disaster recovery. And disaster recovery is if that region goes down and you're not highly available, or even if you are, how quickly can you get that back up and running? Whenever there's an outage or a problem, how quickly can you recover from that? And this, there's deep fields of expertise in, how to do that for databases, how to do that for applications, how to do that for, Kubernetes or container orchestrator clusters and things like that. So it's pretty broad, but the general idea for scalable architecture is to make sure that your architecture and your infrastructure looks and behaves as it should with the perspective of what your applications are needing to do, and make sure that they're available as often as your availability tolerance dictates they should be.
Okay. Some of that came across pretty complex to me, and that's okay. I have a question about that in a little bit later, so I'll put a pin in responding to that. And I want to ask Chris. Chris, do you feel like these four sort of components, automation, pipeline, infrastructure as code, scalable architecture, and then high availability and disaster recovery, that these are sort of the essential elements of responsibility for a DevOps consultant, or is something missing?
I think it's part of that. I think you have to throw security into there. As we're just putting these infrastructure in place, you have to have security. You have to make sure that the teams are communicating. We didn't talk about anything about monitoring, and we want to make sure we can monitor these apps so we can provide feedback on their performance, know when to scale them. I think that's those are three good points. And like I said, we want to be fostering the communication between the different various teams, especially when we talk about security. Other places might have audit requirements and compliance requirements. We need to talk to those departments. So I think there's a lot of people thing that we didn't talk about there, beyond just let's go through and set up servers and set up code and set up pipelines. That's part of it. A lot of it is the people. We've got to do. We got to make sure we're talking, communicating, because that's a big part of what DevOps is.
Okay. I'm also going to put a little pin in communication because I do want to come back to that, but I want to kind of keep the kind of conversation flow going right now with like definitions. So thank you. We will circle back to communication as well as complexity. Another question that I had that was in this purview of talking about different terminology around DevOps and the DevOps field. Working in a big team, I've come across the job title, and it was actually mentioned, I think, by Chris early on when I was asking how do you refer to a DevOps individual? Site reliability engineer. And one thing I've never known is what in the heck is a reliability problem? So what is a reliability problem? And do you feel like that's in the purview of a DevOps master electrician? Chris, why don't you start us off?
So, there's a lot of terms that when we start talking about DevOps, there's a lot of terms in there. You hear DevOps, DevOps, DevOps engineer. You mentioned the site reliability engineer, and a new one that we're starting to hear more about is platform engineering. So when you think about DevOps in there, the DevOps engineer is kind of like the day one person. We're looking at getting your application deployed. The site reliability engineer is day two. Once it's deployed and running, they're doing the daily care and feeding of the application.
And infrastructure.
Okay, so site reliability is like strongly in the camp of operations. Do I have that right?
I would say that's there's more of the operation side of that. They're still having the communication with everyone, but as we more companies adopt DevOps, the teams are getting larger. You need more people. Reliability engineers more on the operation side. We're starting to hear platform engineer as a title within DevOps, which is more of taking care of that infrastructure. The infrastructure is code, the network infrastructure, taking care of a little bit of that. But, the DevOps engineer, the DevOps consultant, I think is still at the center of that. They're the ones that are taking all these operations team, making sure we're communicating correctly with the developer, and not letting the developer get overwhelmed by he wants a site deployed. He shouldn't need to go talk to 5 people. We're the person that they need to be talking to. We'll take care of everything on the back end and keep them informed.
Yeah, so I like that
Okay.
perspective
Mick,
of, yeah, I'm chime in here, beat you to the punch. So I like the perspective of an SRE is like the day two person, and so that gets us closer to answering the question about like what is a reliability problem, or maybe that would even shed more light on what an SRE is. A reliability problem would be, like I said about, a data center going down or a region having an outage or something like that.
Mhm.
If there's a problem in your application and you have a memory leak and the app, one of your instances of your service or application keeps going down over and over again, somebody should be alerted about that, and the person that should be alerted would probably be an SRE. If if you have a high bottleneck, high latency between communication across some of your services, and it should be going faster, but it's not, like digging into that and trying to figure out what the bottleneck is, where the traffic is being slowed down, would also be, largely in the purview of an SRE in collaboration with developers and stuff. So like a reliability problem is really a lot of what it sounds like. Is your application reliable? Um, and if not, digging into that, like troubleshooting that and diagnosing that problem, falls under the purview of an SRE often.
And I think the SRE is also being a little bit proactive. If they're seeing they
Right.
just saw the release go in, all of a sudden memory utilization, goes up. That's when we start having that communication with back to the developer to give them that feedback. Hey, something within your application, changed and memory usage has doubled, and make sure if was that expected. If it's not expected, it could be indication of a problem that we could be proactive about. So now you had a small change, it made something negative, and now you can go back and maybe take a look and see what did I do, what can I do to make this better, or is this just the way it's going to be in the future?
okay. So, um, honestly, I had this question for later, but I really feel like I want to transition to it now because, as I ask you guys these questions and you answer them, you're referring to, you're pointing towards various different sort of like features or services or tasks that like interconnect, which basically gets me to this question, which is like, one of the biggest anxieties I've had about like trying to dip my front end toes into the DevOps pool is just like the complexity of, like, at least the perceived complexity of configurations and integrations across all these services. It just feels like a lot of moving parts. And like for me, for example, being a front end developer, my favorite days are the days where I'm working on some isolated, tricky algorithmic problem in like a little bit of a bubble. So, as two DevOps consultants, do you feel the DevOps landscape, work scope is a complex one? And if it is a complex one, as DevOps jugglers, how do you keep that complexity down, in the delivery cycle? Is that a common problem that you have? And if so, how do you solve it? Mick, why don't we start with you on this one?
It is very complex. I will often have, like working on things on, especially if you have one person, that's working like across the board, or even if I'm working with a team of developers and also like building out infrastructure. I'll have like my code terminal open to 4 different repos that I'm working with. I've got like the cloud provider thing up. I've got, the application, like, endpoints up or documentation about that up, and like there are often so many different interconnecting pieces, and if you want to do that well at scale, there needs to be separation, and there are reasons for having that separation, which leads to the, or at least contributes to the complexity. But then also, like, there are so many tools. Go take a look at landscape.cncf.io, and you'll see, like, if you're a company these days, you're a technology company. If you're a technology company, you're probably in the cloud, and if you're in the cloud, you're looking at this landscape of tools, and there are hundreds of tools in there, and there's a lot of overlap between different tools for every category that you could pick. There are competitors, in there, and deciding which one is the best fit for your team is a big challenge. And yeah, and it's very complex. And then working with like there's a goal to try to minimize that. Like take the observability layer, for example. The observability layer is generally speaking metrics, logs, and tracing. And there are tools for metrics, there are tools for logs, there are tools for tracing. And so if a developer has a problem, do you want to go to 3 different tools? That also adds to their complexity in being able to debug a problem. And so there's, at least in the observability layer side, there's a general goal to try to have what's called a single pane of glass, so that you can have one place to kind of look at things and correlate all of this information together. And so that, like, there are a lot of aims to reduce complexity from like the tools that are available to use. And then as a DevOps consultant, we work to try to make sure that we, the whole dry, do not, don't repeat yourself is very common, both in infrastructure as code, as well as like your pipeline architecture, how you build how you develop your applications so that you have common pipelines that work for any type of application is often a pretty good approach, so that you can minimize the variance of what you have to change in your pipelines and things like that. And again, it really all comes back to communication. Like, how many teams, how many developers do you have working? What are they doing? Ideally, you give them the option to be able to do what they want to do, and then come up with patterns and strategies to add abstraction layers and automations, so that they can focus on what they want to do and reduce complexity through automation.
Chris, anything you want to add to that?
No, I agree with a lot of
Mick
what
sum it up pretty well.
He's stated there's a lot of tools. There's a lot of ways you can, in AWS, there's half a dozen different ways you can create an object within there. Several ways with infrastructure as code, manual, command line. There's even a couple different tools, that overlap and do the exact same thing, and just, Terraform and CloudFormation. So when you start looking at it, it's a lot of it is, that's why we have these DevOps, consultants. We do research. We have experience with a lot of these different technologies, and we want to make sure we help people, select the right ones that are going to help them move forward, while trying to keep the number of tools spread to a minimum. You're going to need tools. You're going to need your processes. But like I said, we want to do repeatable processes, and automations. Don't repeat yourself. Exactly. That's exactly what we do a lot of times.
I want to get at this complexity, or reducing complexity in 2 different ways here, really quick. With 2 different questions. The first question is, so on the front end, at least, and it sounds like this is ubiquitous across, all departments. We often have rules of thumb or best practices that are shared by developers. And, one of the benefits of sharing best practices is oftentimes, if those practices are shared across all the developers, it can minimize or reduce to some extent complexity, because the practices are shared. And they're often shared too, because they have an intention and a purpose that's typically the best one. I just defined best practices. So for example, on the front end, as you guys already mentioned, I can think of dry, do not repeat yourself. Potentially, you could say single source of truth is a best practice. And then I think this is more of a Batovi internal one. Services as hooks is a pretty cool one. And I'm curious, on the DevOps side, do you guys have similar, acronyms, best practices that you guys hold yourselves to? Like you've said, dry. I heard single pane of glass in the observability layer, for example. Are there any other common ones that are always sort of in your back pocket or in your head that you're thinking about? Whoever wants to start on this one.
Yeah, I think the big thing is that we spend a lot of time making sure that we're not, we're creating templates for everything, so that we take the variables out. So now here I have an object that I could deploy. It could be an EKS cluster or a Helm chart with a container image. The more parameters I can pull out of that, and I can go then make reuse of that code very easily. I have a module to create an EKS cluster. I can go in there and change a couple of parameters, copy one file, and now I can create a whole new environment in a matter of minutes. Run the command, and it'll take Amazon's going to take it longer to do all their work than it take me. The same thing with Helm charts. I go through, change a couple of parameters. Now I'm deploying, to multiple environments within a matter of minutes. And that's kind of how, we're trying to do in DevOps. How can we do things faster? So, creating these templates for all these objects, it really helps us out doing that.
Templating. Okay. Anything you want to add, Mick?
Yeah, I'm trying to think through I think there are at times a trade-off between complexity and best practices. And one reason I say that is because one best practice that jumps to the front of my mind is the idea of separating your application repository from your deployment repository and your infrastructure as code. So like a lot of people, and there are use cases for maybe defining infrastructure as code in your app or service repositories. And I would say it might be better to do that as a template. Like maybe if you define the template of your Helm chart in your app repo separately from the populating of values that go into that template, which would be done in like your deployment repo. And one reason to do this is because you can kind of keep your environment descriptions in your deployment repo. Ideally, your app is something that can be built, build once, deploy anywhere is like one best practice. So if you have your app or service repo built in such a way that it can basically just like it stops at publishing an artifact, ideally a versioned artifact, and it can be deployed anywhere, all the way up through to production. So you build it once, it can be deployed anywhere, it's been tested. And then you have your deployment repo, which we often call an operations repo, where you define your environments and your infrastructure and how your application is deployed from an environment perspective, like how many replicas you want in prod versus staging, for example. And I think though, like to me, those like that separation is a good best practice, but it leads to a more complex setup. If you have well, I mean, for some, for the overall picture, maybe it's more simple because you have common patterns and approaches, and your pipeline architecture, which is on its own generally very, it can be very complex to set up pipelines to do all of the different things that automations need to do. But that becomes more simple if you have this common approach, and say you can go from 1 to 50 microservices, different repos, and they all follow the same pattern. So each one might be a little bit more complex, or somebody that has to work across both of those. It's rather complex, but from an overarching like pipelining perspective and general pattern based approach, it might be more straightforward, or more like easier to reason about because you have these, the sort of criteria for separation. One example I'll give of that, or I guess one quick analogy that I'll make is like Kubernetes. A lot of people don't know what Kubernetes is, but it's whenever you start looking into Kubernetes, it looks very complex. And like it's probably accurate to say that it is complex. But if you focus on trying to learn all the bits and pieces of Kubernetes and how to make Kubernetes work, there are a lot of different things to do. But if you focus on the pattern of what Kubernetes, like how Kubernetes works, Kubernetes is a lot easier to reason about. So a lot of times what we'll do is focus on those patterns for like your DevOps pipelines and your end-to-end delivery setup for your applications, and work with patterns to reduce that complexity, because you can look at the pattern and then reason about the implementation, as opposed to looking at each implementation and they're all different. It's a lot harder to reason about at scale.
Okay. Yeah, I'm over here staring down intently, just like focusing all of my resources on thinking about what you're saying. Patterns as the guide for implementation, and focusing on patterns to implement, using Kubernetes as an example. Cool. It sounds like there's a conversation to be had about Kubernetes. I have one more question about towards complexity from a different direction. You both of you have independently kind of mentioned pieces of this, so I think it's good to bring it up. So also, again, referenced in the complete guide to DevOps, there was this thing called the 8 pillars of DevOps, which are listed as, these are the 8 pillars: source control, pipeline runners, continuous integration, continuous delivery, hosting, observability, continuous feedback, and security. So looking at those pillars and thinking about how you guys have discussed those pillars, and how, for example, in the observability layer, you'll consider when it comes on a client by client basis, as far as the observability layer is concerned, for example, what tool you want to use, because there are so many tools out there. That made me think of this question about work scoping. On my end, I know one way that I feel like I can manage complexity at the outset at almost like a project managey sort of level is by looking at whatever story, feature, or epic I'm trying to define, and scoping what what the minimal viable product is, so to speak, what the objectives are there. Do you guys use these 8 pillars or some variation therein to scope new work, or like whenever you're coming into a new client, or as a checklist when you're coming onto an existing client with an existing DevOps base? How do these 8 pillars work for you guys in the conversation of scoping work, if at all? Mick, why don't you start us off?
I think the end goal for a project is to have all of those pillars involved, and more. There's that might not be all of them even necessarily, but that's the bulk of, I think, what generally you'd want to have, and the end goal is to have that. I think the question is how to get there from where we start, and so a lot of times we will look at all of those, and then we'll prioritize with our clients, like what is the immediate goal. If developers are pushing their code, and even if there's a manual deployment process, but whenever code gets out there, things break often. That might be a use case to prioritize CI and getting tests and things like that built in. It really depends on like what the situation is for how we prioritize doing those. And in a lot of cases, you can parallelize stuff. There are some dependencies, like it's kind of hard to deploy to something that doesn't exist, right? So you need to have your you need to have your hosting and infrastructure set up to some degree to be able to actually deploy to that. So yeah, I mean, it really depends. And I guess the short answer to that is, I think our end goal is to have all those things set up. And the idea of like shift left is a common term in DevOps, which means like do the important things first, and deciding for a project what things to do first is not always clear. And it's usually a case by case basis, depending on where people are, what their goals and priorities are. Again, back to the communication thing. We work with our clients to understand that.
So theoretically, if I were like, yes, new client, I am going to be your sole DevOps person, and I am going to set up your operations flow for your operations for your delivery flow. I could theoretically go to these 8 pillars, and albeit there's a lot of depth in each of those pillars and a lot of information behind each of those little bullet points, but I could theoretically use those as a kind of checklist. How many need to get checked off and in what order, it depends, but they sort of cover the possible scope of work for a project. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and during the initial discovery, you're obviously going to have some of that. Source code, they're going to have a repository more than likely already. So some of these are already going to be pre-existing. We just need to figure out where they're at, or what tools they're using, so we can bring new processes and procedures to help them overcome the errors and difficulties that they're experiencing.
Yeah,
like I'm not gonna honest. Yeah, go for it, Mick.
I was just going to say that a lot of those pillars, or like the bulk of those pillars, are focused on the technological side, and I want to reemphasize sort of this underlying sort of energy of DevOps, which is communication, collaboration. Like, one of there's continuous feedback in there, but that's like continuous feedback as part of the mechanism for your automated delivery process. But maybe like the overarching one is like, what are your communication channels? Do people have documentation set up? a place that whenever somebody learns or implements something new, that other people can learn from that. Is there, are there good chat channels set up if somebody's like, over off in a corner and doesn't have the ability to communicate with somebody they need to communicate with? Do you have good, ceremony involved? Like, are people meeting regularly and like talking about their updates and stuff like that? Like that, I don't know if you'd call that a pillar of DevOps as opposed to like just the underlying sort of basis of what DevOps is. But I think that's
foundation of DevOps.
yeah, that's very much one of the first things that we look at and make sure that if we're going to be working with a client, we need to make sure that people are communicating effectively, and then we can look at those pillars to kind of set up a roadmap.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is sort of my last big question for our talk today. As you multiple times throughout each question, like, it always comes back to communication being this essential point. There was this like, day one, day two is sort of ops, day one is DevOps. And then, there's this almost, at least in my mind, from what I'm hearing, like project managery level need for communication, or need for DevOps to bring that kind of level of communication to the team, and be like a bridge between developers and operations. And I'm curious, one, to know if I have that right, and two, why do you feel communication is so essential for DevOps? And is that your experience, like your common experience working with other folks in DevOps? Obviously not naming names or anything, or is it more like a wish list thing rather than a real world thing? Because, for example, as a developer, obviously communication is important. I've come across and worked with several developers who are, had great tech salt, like they knew what they were doing, but they just weren't communicative. And sometimes they would misunderstand something, they would implement something, it would get done, and it would lead to problems down the road because they didn't communicate. So, we preach communication, but we don't always get that back. So I'm curious, again, why do y'all feel it's so essential? And is that your common experience working with other DevOps pioneers? Chris, why don't you kick us off?
So, I'm a old school operations guy. Before we had DevOps, I was, we manually moved code to the servers. And we had bad communication with development teams. I like to say sometimes it felt like they were throwing the stuff over the fence. Here's the files, copy them at 3 a.m. And at 3 a.m., the application blows up and we're fighting to find people and figure out what's going on, just because we didn't know what the changes were. So, as everything's matured, DevOps came around, and that's, the big thing is the communication. So we understand what we're doing and why. A lot of times you have that big thing, developers are seeing the developer there. It's not my code, runs on my laptop. Well, that's kind of the reason there's DevOps today. We want to go through it. Your code doesn't run on this infrastructure that I'm supporting. So let's work together to find out why. Let's work together to understand what your needs are before you need them. Because you come to me, I want to deploy this tomorrow, and you have all these infrastructure needs. It does take some time to get all that stuff put together. So when we start talking the communication, and especially like you said at project level, it really helps. Especially as the DevOps are going to be leading the efforts for the back end and the operations team. We really want to make sure that we understand your timelines, what you're asking for, and we're going to communicate it back. If you ask for an unrealistic goal, we're going to tell you, so you can make sure you make your adjustments well beforehand.
Sorry, I didn't realize I muted myself. Okay. Well, one big takeaway I'm having from that, and Mick, I wanna bounce it to you too, is DevOps is a big role. I am getting, as I learn more details about it and get more of a finesse around it, I am really just seeing like it has a lot of responsibility baked in there. But like, yeah, basically it sounds like you need a DevOps. I already said Pokemon Master, but I'll do that one again because I liked it so much. You need a DevOps Pokemon Master there to bridge the gap between the developers and the operations team, and like that missing link, that missing puzzle piece is is the DevOps person who can speak to both sides and, integrate those conversations together and weave them where there might be vocabulary or syntax that is off. Mick, is there anything you want to add to that about the essentialness of communication for DevOps, or / like the actual, presence of it in your day-to-day work?
Oh yeah. So I want to like explore a progression here. So like it is possible for a company to have a good DevOps setup, call it implementation, but it's possible for a company to have good DevOps without an individual or a team promoting and facilitating it. So it's highly unlikely, I would say, because there are a lot of tools and things that need to be built. But like operators can build and provide tools, developers can work with the tools, and they can just collaborate with each other naturally. There's nothing stopping that from happening, especially if you have I think it's probably rare, especially if you have larger organizations who have previous patterns and processes in place, and you want to, and have like the more siloed approach to dev and ops. It's a lot harder to like change from the past to sort of this new, highly collaborative approach to problem solving, in which case it makes sense to have somebody there to advocate for collaboration, communication, like, hey, manager, we don't have this chat tool available. Can we get this chat tool so people can talk with each other? Like kind of work with that, work with the teams. Oh, you have a problem. They have a solution. So like, set up those communication channels, or, hey, here's this documentation or whatever. Like, so setting up and facilitating that. It's very, what was I going to say? It's also possible to have somebody in the middle, like somebody implementing DevOps, which, again, arguably could be called a DevOps engineer if they're like implementing that culture of DevOps. But you could also have somebody who is like just, like an automations engineer or a cloud engineer, or, some of those other tool terms, who are not necessarily building the culture or implementing the culture of DevOps, but are providing the tooling for developers and operators to work together without actually doing the communication themselves. Like, they can provide the tools and not do the advocacy. So that's also possible. I would say that's probably not ideal. Like, ideally, you have somebody who's there and is talking with both sides and working on implementations and providing the tools for collaboration, communication, and working together, and also advocating for others to, to collaborate in similar ways. That's the way that we try to approach it. Whenever we come in doing DevOps consulting for our clients, we try to advocate for people to collaborate and work together on both sides, and, break down those silos. But it's definitely possible, and maybe even common, that folks that are in the what is now the DevOps engineer title, or somebody implementing DevOps, a lot of those people are coming from a background of silos and don't necessarily have haven't had incentive traditionally to promote that, and maybe aren't like working towards promotion of collaboration and communication. It's obviously very important, and there's like some project management level stuff that we always end up doing or helping facilitate. Maybe we're working with the project managers to help kick this stuff off. But yeah, I mean, it's common that somebody in that role is not themselves doing a lot of the communication collaboration, because they've been like shifted over into this role from something that was less compatible. But I think ideally the case is, when you have somebody coming in to implement DevOps as a culture and the implementations for a company, you have those people also advocating for working together and going through those practices and stuff.
Well, yeah, I know in my experience, it is never a bad thing when someone says we should communicate more. That almost always leads to positive results in my experience. So we've run long, and that is on your moderator. But I just want to say, like, there are more questions. Well, that's the thing. I didn't have to hold it up because y'all were doing really well, which I'm like pleased about, but also disappointed because this morning I made this and before I had coffee, so I was really grumpy as I made this, and like I didn't get to use it. But whatever. Anyway, um, there are clearly a bunch of other questions that could have been asked here, and we could have gone into more detail on some of these answers. This is, if anything, a good primer for potential follow-up. But I want to thank both of you for coming on this with me today to like answer these questions for me. I'm hoping to learn more about DevOps as I continue to grow as a professional. I think it's an essential field, and I hate not knowing things. So I'm sure I'll be pestering you both asynchronously with more questions about DevOps as we go forward. But one more time, I wanna just mention, like, this is the Batovi channel, and we offer lots of Q&As, live stream coding sessions, and web dev tutorials in a similar field and of different specific sections of code that people are encouraged to check out on their own time. And don't forget to check out the complete guide to DevOps on the Batovi website if you want to see more details again about DevOps that sort of inspired this conversation and these questions today. Mick, I want to make sure I give you a chance if there's anything you'd like to add to about DevOps at Batovi.
Well, I mean, like you said, there are a lot of questions that weren't asked. There's a lot of depth for a lot of the questions that were asked that wasn't explored, and we are looking to provide more ongoing conversations like this on Twitch coming forward. So be on the lookout for that kind of stuff. And then also directly after this, we have our open source office hours. If you have questions about DevOps, hop over to the Batovi community Slack, and you'll see how to join there, and you can hop on there and talk with us, some DevOps consultants at Batovi about just general DevOps things. If you have a question, a concern, anything like that.
That sounds good. I'll try to be on there myself. I think I need to grab some coffee really quick. Chris, Mick, thank you guys both so much. It's been a pleasure, and thank you everybody for joining us today. See you soon. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.